Economist's advice to people to cut down on spending or buying things on credit or debt. Demand for housing is still high for the country, and those who don't have money to pay full price to buy a property opt to apply for home loans. Banks usually have an assessor to evaluate the property to check if a person is getting value for money before buying. Now, to tell us a little bit more about this, we're joined in studio by Mr. Stephen Barker, who's the head of home loans at Standard Bank. A very good morning to you, Mr. Barker. Thanks for joining us. Before we get into the procedures, I'd like to get your reaction on the recent, we've dealt with it in a couple of interviews now, historical debt, being liable for that. Your reaction to it, and also how do you think it would affect the marketplace?
Yeah, so I think we're most certainly watching, sort of those sort of proceedings. I think any time when you potentially buy something and there's an uncertainty that hangs over it, sort of could be problematic. So, I think let's see where it goes. At the moment, it started in a sort of few small cases, but, if it became a bigger issue, I most certainly would see it as a bit of a negative drag onto the housing market.
You think it could really have that kind of effect on the housing market? And right now, are you seeing any effect in the immediate term, if one can call it that?
So you're not seeing anything, right now, but it is that bit of the, how do you get into something if you don't know what your liability is? And so I think what it'll end up leading is it'll lead to other changes to provide that uncertainty. So I think we're just probably through a period where, there has to be clarity provided of exactly what are the expectations.
Now, we're bombarded with information, of course, right now in South Africa around the state of economy and what we should be and shouldn't be doing. We should be saving money and we shouldn't be spending. Belt tightening is the buzzword that's come out of Parliament. Just give us an idea. We've got on the screen a strapline there that says, is it a good time to be buying or selling property right now? As the out-and-out expert, what do you tell us?
Yeah, so I think one's got to be very careful that you don't sort of try and look at the economy too much. Because at the end of the day, this thing, a home purchasing fulfills a need. You need to sort of put a shelter over the family. And two, no matter if you're buying or good times, bad times, one always needs to sort of look at it within your own circumstances. Can I afford? How does it fit my lifestyle?
And a sort of general view, where we now, when the economy is a little bit depressed, prices, do they come down significantly? Is it a good opportunity for you to now, I wouldn't say make a mint, but to invest when prices are a little bit lower?
So I think there is that sort of possibility. And I mean, it's almost a supply and demand type discussion. So you will find some areas where all of a sudden you've got sort of more buyers. If you've got more buyers, less sellers, you're going to sort of find that price maintains. But then, you might have areas where the stock starts to sort of creep up, where potentially buyers have a little bit more power. But I think with it is, at the end of the day, you're probably not going to find any major sort of bargains per se. And, if we do see bank defaults go up, some people like to sort of look at the distressed property portfolios or distressed properties to look for better value. But one has to exercise great caution when buying in those, those types of properties.
How do you ensure that you get value for money? What are the key indicators an amateur should be on the lookout for, if one can say that?
Yeah, so I think the thing with the way one's got to look at property ownership is, let's not, it's not short term. So it is long term. And I think with it is, people can get too isolated on just thinking about what the particular property is doing, but it needs to fit your overall lifestyle. So things like location, more central, sort of things that are closer to amenities that you'd sort of need, schools and all the rest, will generally perform better through time.
Well, that's very interesting. Just other advice that you could give to someone who's sitting here watching this, considering, hey, I think I should buy, or I think I might get a second property to invest. If you had a word of advice for either of those people.
Yeah, so I think regardless of which one you go to, is that there's no just sort of easy thing. So I think sometimes you hear people sort of say, I bought the second property because that just sort of, and it's going to return, great investment. I think no matter what the time is, you need to do your homework. So if I'm going to live in it, how does that sort of fit? What are the maintenance associated? What are my costs, to run the property? And can I afford the bond? If interest rates do start to move, you need a degree, of buffer. Yeah. I think probably the most important thing is property mustn't be seen to be too short term. So if I buy a house and I try to, sort of sell that house in 3 years' time with a big bond, I'm probably going to find it quite awkward because I haven't had enough time for the asset to grow to cover all the associated transaction costs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that people aren't normally look at. Just tell us a little bit more about the procedures and maybe the things to be on the lookout for when buying land or property in this case.
Yeah, so I think with it is, if you look at property particularly, is you're going to go in, the first thing is about yourself and your finances. So we've sort of touched on that, but a critical thing. And I think that sort of comes to the forefront, specifically, when we start to talk about tougher economic times. But I think the property and the area that you're buying is rather critical because I think, if you could sort of cut down a commute to work, that will save you other money as well. That sort of convenience factor is quite big.
Yeah.
And then I think the third thing with it is watch out for the sort of what does a property look like in terms of maintenance and how much maintenance is it going to cost you going forward. And that's sort of whether I own the property or ultimately sort of rent it out. Maybe the fourth, if you add out for the investor, is, what's going to happen, what's my rental potential yield going to be, and if I have to sort of move between tenants, how easy is that going to be to make sure I don't have to sort of buffer too many shortfalls.
Give us a quick overview of the South African property market right now. What kind of state are we in?
Yeah, so I think, if we look at it, we've probably come out of a period for the last couple of years where property prices have grown slightly above inflation, but, nothing spectacular. So we've been coming out of a period where, so property prices have been moving up. But I think if you sort of zone in certain high demand areas, you'll find that, property prices are moving more aggressively in those areas. And you're also seeing property activity seems to be, slightly more centralized around your bigger centers, your Gauteng, KZN and Durban, north of Durban. And then when you start to think of the Western Cape type area. So you're definitely seeing more transactions in there. But I think we're in a period where you're seeing location is ultimately driving property price increase.
We've always, or in recent years, let's call it that, we've attracted a lot of foreign investment into the property market in South Africa. Is that starting to lose a little bit of momentum, or do we still see the Germans investing here heavily in South Africa?
Yeah, as I say, it's not something that we keep that close to, because a lot of those particular purchases would be cash. But I think the general view is that it's not as big as we think. So, yes, there might be pockets in certain parts of the country where we find high density or high activity from foreigners, but as a broader market, it's absolutely a small percentage of the overall market.
In conclusion, if you had to give me as the layman advice as to where the market is right now and maybe what the next couple of years are going to look like, if you could give me a heads up, as it were, what would that be?
Yeah, so I think with it, I think people must not get too sensitive on overall property price growth. For most people, what are you going to do? You're going to be living in the property. If you didn't own it, you probably would be renting something or you'd be incurring some degree of cost. So I think one's got to watch that you don't get overly fascinated. I think if somebody was looking at a short-term in and out, then they're more sensitive to growth. But I think our own personal financial situations are something that we have to be a lot more proactive, a lot more disciplined at the moment. So, if I'm battling to make ends meet every single month, let me find that problem sooner than, when eventually sort of things are out of control. So it's just keep those sort of belts tightened as you sort of started out with.
Absolutely. And the bottom line is it's a long-term investment and don't spend money that you don't have.
Absolutely. Great sum.
Well, thank you very much. Stephen Barker is the head of HomeLoans at Standard Bank here in South Africa. Some sage advice for you thinking that now's the time to splash the cash in the property market. Well, only if you have it. Only if you have it. And then think about a 10-year investment period instead of trying to make a quick buck in 12 or 18 months. That's the advice from Stephen Barker. Thank you for joining us this morning. Now, of course, it's voting weekend. The Independent Electoral Commission has urged all eligible voters to go out and register. Also,